The movement of Impressionism. And for me, when I think of Impressionism, I think about the idea of perception. What do we really see, right? What are our impressions, right, of the world? And I think the core sort of investigatory impulse of these artists really was to consider how do we see what we see? And they wanted to create something beyond sort of the finished subject style, the finished style we'd seen in other movements. The best way I can kind of contrast this is kind of giving you realism again and giving you impressionism. And realism, when we talk about it as sort of a revolutionary subject. The idea that showing people these workers and these everyday people that would have been considered really unusual and bizarre. That would have been the shocking thing here. So I would say with realism, it was about revolutionary subject matter. Now, if you look at Impressionism, it's not about revolutionary subject matter, it's about revolutionary style. So, this idea of what is an impression? The Impressionist artists wanted to use the style that was unfinished. And if you think about what I've said about a lot of these movements before, it's about, no, these are finished works, right? They're supposed to look finished. But Impressionists are very interested in this idea of can you have an unfinished look that complements the subject matter that you're using? Can you investigate more open brushstroke, unfinished brushstrokes, colors blending into each other, bleeding into each other? Can you have an impression, right? And call that a finished artwork? It will lead to a lot of critiques for them. But again, I think if you look at their style, that's what's really revolutionary. The subject matter they actually use is quite pedestrian. They use, people at cafes, like you see here. They use people walking down streets, right? They use mothers and their families. They use landscape. So the subjects to me are very pedestrian or everyday, but the style is really where it's at. And the style is all about sort of, considering how optics, how your eyes, right, perceive the color and the light around you to create the vision that you're seeing. And one of the things that comes to my mind when I think of Impressionism is just how we see colors. For instance, we were building a new house, and I remember kind of looking at color schemes with my husband, and he was always seeing the colors slightly different than me. Like I was like, oh, that's like a mauve, and he would be like, oh, it's more like a fuchsia, and I was like, oh, okay, this is where it really gets interesting. Where even as an art historian, and I never really considered that the colors as I see them is not how each individual person might be seeing them as well. So that our vision of the world is very personal to us. And again, it's through our personal optics or the personal way we're seeing the color and the light interactions happening as we view objects in the scene before us. And the other thing that the Impressionists were considering is like, can you, document things that are momentary, like changes in the light? Like here, you're looking at like a sunrise, right? So can you document something that's creating fleeting lighting conditions, fleeting color changes, right? And they wanted to try to capture moments in time based on these optical changes. And normally what would happen before this is, art pieces were considered kind of a timeless vision of something. And so here we're getting sort of a snapshot, a second in time. That's what the Impressionists really wanted to consider, is that snapshot or that moment in time that they were looking at. And they wanted to use that as their inspiration. And again, if you compare contrast this, you can look at something like a neoclassical painting in contrast to the Monet that you see on the right that we'll talk about in further depth. Here I'm just using them as a stylistic contrast. I'm not really trying to get too much further into it. If you can recognize the detail, as we say on the left, then you are definitely a good art history student. A detail, by the way, is a small part of a painting blown up. So we call them details. I actually had a professor in college who only tested us using details. So if you think I'm hard, no. This man would only show us like this piece, and you'd have to be like, oh, to the ratio, recognize that foot. He made you learn your paintings. Like you had to know every square inch of them, not a generalized idea. So, but if you look at this detail of the Oath of the Horatii, I had mentioned before that someone like David would have finished brush strokes that look like glass. Perfect, precision. You can't see them. They're erased. It looks like a photograph. That was considered the hallmark of a good painter. So imagine Impressionist painters as they break away from that, how much critique they were going to get for having this messy, sloppy, unfinished style. Again, the term Impressionism comes from critics talking about these works when they first saw them and being like, that's not a finished artwork, that's just an impression, that's just a sketch. And what the Impressionists did was take that criticism and turn it into something that they found powerful. That's something they wanted to define themselves with. I hope you've been noticing as we get more towards the 20th century in modern and contemporary art, more and more artists don't care as much about what the critics have to say. They often will say, "That's nice that a critic, thinks this work is bad. We'll start a salon de refusé," or "That's nice that you think this work is unfinished, right? We're going to call ourselves the Impressionist," right? They throw it back in the critic's face a lot more, and I find that to be a lot of fun. But it shows you that art for art's sake mentality, that a lot of artists were taking their own defining of themselves into their own hands, right? They were like, I'm gonna speak to my agenda. You don't get to define it for me. And that's more and more what modern and contemporary artists will do. So keep that in mind. But again, if you just look at the compare and contrast here, you can see a world of difference between a neoclassical painter's way of approaching brushwork and impressionist painter's way of approaching brushwork, and they're worlds apart. Some other things I wanted you to know about Impressionism before we really start to look heavily at the artworks is just some of the themes that they used and some of the ways that they oriented themselves in their society. One of the things that they were known for is what we call plein air landscapes. So if you hear someone saying, "I paint en plein air," they're using the French phrase to mean I paint outdoors. I paint in the open air, en plein air, on the open air. And you might say, well, why is this so exciting? No one was really painting en plein air before the Impressionists came along. They painted in their studios. So consider the fact that all the landscapes you've seen before this have been painted from memory or sketches, right? The person would go out to the landscape, maybe take a sketch or something, make some graphite sketches, some charcoal sketches, and take them back to the studio and then paint from that viewpoint or that vantage, right, of the information. But people weren't painting on location. They were painting in their studios. The main reason why they were painting in their studios is they had to have all their paint equipment there. They had to mix their paints. They had to do all this really, almost scientific methodology setup work. Mixing paints is actually quite, a scientific, job to do. It's not as easy as you might think. So they wanted to have all their materials, right, in the studio with them, and they'd be able to manipulate them there. Well, what gets invented towards the end of the 1800s, but what we call the collapsible paint tube. If you're an artist, you've seen these in art stores. They're the metal tubes with the crimped ends. They're collapsible paint tubes. This is invented, and right around the Impressionists, when they start working, it gave artists the ability to mix their paints, package them into the collapsible paint tube, and crimp up the end, pack them in their kit, and off they went out into the plein air, right, the plein air, to paint. This opened up huge doors, obviously, for artists because they could then go out into the landscape and paint. Literally, they could go out, and do these things. So painters like Monet, who did the Haystacks in the Rouen Cathedral piece you're looking at here, they were noted for being some of the first artists to truly paint in the landscape. And because of that, it affects the subject matter that they use. So you'll see things like, just objects from the natural world, pieces of architecture, different kinds of things as the focus of their subjects. Another important subject to consider is the Impressionist interest in what we call the flâneur. Flâneur is a French term, and it means someone who walks about looking at life. That's the best way I can define it. Someone who likes to walk about observing, right, the world around them. That's a flâneur. And if you read the philosophy of this time, the literature of this time, the flâneur was a large figure, right, in their everyday sort of doings. This idea of the walkabout, the gadabout, right, someone who, again, was social, was moving about the city. This was what their life was about. The Enlightenment had brought urbanism, and now this urbanism has been fully realized. Most people are living in cities now. Most people are in these environments. They're going out to tea, right? They're going to, have a lunch, right? They're going to the ballet. And as they pass each other in the street, they observe each other. I love the kaibo on the right, where the man and the woman are sort of looking off at something that we can't see out of the frame. I think that says a lot about what the flaneurs were about. And I often describe it also as seeing and being seen, because there was this attitude of, you're looking at those around you, but you know that they're looking at you too. So there's this constant sense of observation and surveillance that we talk about as being really critical to Impressionist subject matter. Not only were they considering how do you see like the changes in color and light, or how do you observe a moment in time, you have this sense of observation or impression of just the daily life going on around you as subject matter. So it's sort of, again, this idea of the impression or the observation flows into all parts of the subject matter. So artists were going to be very interested in this idea of the flaneur, the person who sees but is seen at the same time. So notice in a lot of these paintings is people looking at each other, right? Or people looking off out of the scene, taking in the world around them. This is when shopping malls and commerce and all those things start to flourish. You can read a lot of thinkers of the time speaking about these things, right? Like I love the idea of the invention of the shopping arcade, and there's a whole sort of group of writings from this time on window shopping and what window shopping is all about. It's observation. Again, it's looking at an object that you covet, right, that you want. And so I love the flaneur. I think it's such an interesting, kind of thing to discuss. If you want to read more about the flaneur, you want to read more about like the shopping arcades, you'd want to read Baudelaire. I gave you a quote from him here because I think it sums up Impressionism well in my mind. Modernity is the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent. Basically, what Baudelaire is saying is that if you want to be a modern person, you can't hope for stability. Everything is changing, everything is in flux, everything is moving around you at all times. And if you really look at these Impressionist works, notice they are about that. They're about, as in class I always do, they're about the snapping of the finger. Life is passing you by, moment to moment to moment to moment. This moment is not the same as this moment, and this moment is not the same as this moment. And they're all going forward. You can't go back. So Baudelaire is thinking about this idea of the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, something you can't put your hands on, that's always changing, that's slipping out of your reach, and is never really fully formulated. That is modern life, right? So this is one of the reasons I start to get really excited around this time of the course, because I am a fan of modernism, because I think it's the truth of how we live right now. We're postmodernist, one might say, but I think we're still very informed by that ethos of movement and change and dynamism and growth and things not being stable, right, for a fixed period of time. The last subject that you really see in Impressionism is what we call the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie subjects. And this used to be something I had to explain in great depth of detail. And now with the rise of the term bougie, I find that I'm off the hook a little bit, right? When someone's said to be bougie, we tend to mean that they might have money but no class, right? The idea that you can't buy style or you can't buy manners or you can't buy taste, right? When you say someone's bougie, you're like, yeah, they got a Louis Vuitton bag, but they got no sense, that kind of thing. And people can see right through them, right? Back in this time, bourgeois was somebody who had a lot of money and a lot of free time on their hands. And so notice what the subject matter is. It's people kind of hanging out, going and partying and drinking and dancing. So I always tell my students Impressionism as a subject matter driven movement is not deep. It's not about anything, deep as far as, sort of what these people are doing half the time. Again, it's the more important implications about modernity in general and life in general that I think are deep. But if you look at these people, they're pretty surface, right? And that's what we would say a bourgeois person is. They're pretty much a surface, but there's nothing in there, There's not a lot of depth to that lake, if you get my drift. But for Impressionists, they love the bourgeois life because these were transitory people. These were people moving and changing and flirting and saying hello and then floating off. The life of social butterflies, I say. That's what you get when you look at the bourgeois and think about them as people. And of course, other people like Degas, they kind of even investigate something like what's the fashion of the time? What are people buying, right? So these are some ladies at the milliners. A milliner is a hat maker, by the way. So that's, what they're doing here is they're going to get fitted for hats, right? But this idea of the shopping habits of the bourgeois, the socializing habits of the bourgeois, that's all part of the subject matter that you really see being used during the Impressionist period. In the next video, right, we're going to go ahead and jump in and start to look at some very specific Impressionist works now that you have a framework to consult.